They said it was a joke. They said she could swim. I remember the hollow splash, the empty sky, the black water swallowing my daughter as if the lake itself were tired of cruelty. When the ambulance lights finally cut the darkness, Preston and his father were already gone, their laughter fading into the pines. I called my older brother and whispered the words that ended my old life and began another. They are heading home now. Do what you do best. My name is Eleanor Hayes, a retired librarian who used to believe that careful order could hold a chaotic world together. I kept the catalog cards straight and the shelves alphabetized, and I thought that if I smiled politely and said please and thank you, life would let my daughter be happy. Her name is Lena. She married into the Van Doren family where everything gleamed and nothing had warmth. Their Lake Tahoe house at Van Dor's Lake felt like a stage set meant to impress outsiders. Dark wood and vast glass, a flawless lawn without a single dandelion cars, polished enough to reflect a person and erase her at the same time. I visited only for her. She would take my hands and beg me to come because it mattered to them. I knew it mattered to her. On that cold afternoon, the wind coming off the water bit through my sweater. Garrett Van Doren and his son Preston had been drinking until the jokes grew louder and sharper. Lena wore a thick jacket and pretended to laugh. I could hear effort in the sound, like a bowstring drawn too tight. Garrett mocked her for bundling up. Preston echoed him the way a shadow echoes a man. I told them to leave her alone. My voice sounded small on that porch, but I said it anyway. The look they exchanged was animal and private, a plan already agreed upon with a glance. They rose in a swagger of liquor and entitlement and took my daughter by the arms. She still tried to play along because the habit of trying to keep the peace had sunk into her bones. On the long, narrow pier, the lake looked like onyx. Foolish, Garrett said. Toughen up, Preston said. The world sharpened to the point of their hands on her coat and the click of a wedding band against wood. I rushed forward. Preston shoved me. Then they pushed her, and she went in without a scream, a pale shape folding into blackness. For a breath or two, there was nothing. Then she surfaced, and I saw blood like a dark ribbon at her temple. Her eyes were empty. Her body went slack and began to sink. The sound that tore from me was not language. Help, I tried to shout, but the men on the shore were already bored. Stop the drama, Preston called. She can swim, Garrett added, and they turned their backs and walked to the SUV. Tires crunched, engine growled. Silence returned, as if cruelty were a door they had closed behind them. Across the water, a fisherman cut his small motor and turned toward my pointing hand. He knew the lake. He hooked Lena's jacket and dragged her into the inflatable boat with a strength that looked like prayer. On the planks, he worked without panic. I dialed 911 and spoke the address like I was reading from a card catalog. The ambulance arrived in a scatter of gravel and rushing feet. Hypothermia, a medic said. Head trauma, low pulse. They wrapped her in silver and breathed for her and moved as one. The fisherman stood with his cap twisting in his hands. I thanked him with a stare, because words were not working for me anymore. As the ambulance door slammed, a cold stillness settled in me, not shock anymore, but purpose. I scrolled to a number I had not called in many years. Isaac, my brother. Once he had been the best investigative reporter I knew, relentless in ways that broke things other men avoided touching. He had been punished for it and exiled from polite circles. He answered on the fourth ring with a voice like smoke. I told him one sentence. They are heading home now. Do what you do best. He did not ask for details. I did not offer them. I ended the call and watched the taillights disappear into the trees, carrying my girl toward a fight for breath. The hospital corridor smelled of bleach and the ache of strangers. A nurse asked questions. A clock said nothing useful. I sat on a metal bench that made my bones feel older. Preston's name glowed on Lena's phone when it rang in my pocket. "Sweetheart," he said when I answered with the exhausted irritation of a man inconvenienced. "Where are you? Put your mother on. Come home. We got carried away." I let the silence stretch until it felt like a wire pulled too tight. "She is alive," I said at last. "Do not come here." He began to protest. I ended the call and folded the phone into my palm like a pebble. In the glass doors, I could see my reflection gray and small and unremarkable, a woman people overlooked at long tables and in expensive foyers. That woman was finished. The lake had taken her and returned something harder. In the hours that followed, a doctor told me Lena's condition was serious but stable. I nodded. I breathed carefully. I stood at the window of her room and watched as evening pressed its forehead to the glass. Somewhere across the city, two men believed they still owned the center of every room. I had given the center to someone else. I had handed it to the truth and to a man who knew how to pull buried threads until the whole fabric came loose. The night pressed in like a held breath. Machines hummed around my daughter, their steady blinking lights, insisting on life 1 second at a time. When the doctor stepped out at 2:10 a.m. and said serious but stable, I felt the words settle in my chest and anchor there. I sat in a hard plastic chair and let the minutes pass while the floor scrubber muttered down the corridor like a low tide. Sometime near dawn, a volunteer wheeled in a cart and offered me coffee that tasted like burnt paper. I drank it anyway. I had the distinct sense of being on a narrow footbridge above a ravine. Every step had to be deliberate. There would be no second attempt at crossing. A small nurse with astonishingly kind eyes touched my elbow and told me I could have 5 minutes. I stood by Lena and traced a fingertip along the edge of the blanket, careful not to disturb the lines and the clips and the pale oval of bandage at her temple. Her lashes trembled. One tear escaped and disappeared into the pillow. There are cries that split the air, and there are sounds too soft for anyone to hear. The soft ones carry longer. I told her I was here. I told her she was not alone. I did not tell her about the call I had made or what it meant. I did not yet have the right to promise outcomes, only the duty to promise presence. By 8:30 a.m., a delivery arrived at the nurse's station. A towering arrangement of white lilies glowed like a small moon. Their perfume rolled down the corridor and turned the air thick. Tucked in the blooms was a folded card on embossed paper. "My dear, let us not allow your mother's theatrics to spoil our evening." I read it twice. The letters were neat and merciless. I placed the card in my pocket as if filing evidence. Then I asked the nurse to take the flowers away. I said Lena was allergic. Maybe she was. Maybe she was not. Either way, the corridor could not carry that scent a minute longer. When my phone rang at 11:05 a.m., the screen showed a number I did not know. Isaac's voice came through gravelly and alert. He had been awake all night. I could hear the map of his thinking in the friction of his words. He did not ask how Lena was because he knew I would have called if the news had turned. He went directly to the point. 2 decades earlier, same lake, a man named Malcolm Pierce, a business partner, who did not live to see the end of a fishing trip. Officially, an accident. Unofficially, something else. A retired detective with a conscience like a trapped bird had talked after enough silence and a careful dose of persuasion. There had been money. There had been threats. There had been a file closed before it could be truly opened. Isaac had found the son of the dead man, a mechanic, whose anger had cooled into ash, but who kept letters in a shoebox like coals that never quite lost their heat. In those letters, the father wrote of shares stripped from him and a plan to go to the district attorney. Then came the lake, the cold, the simple story told to reporters who did not ask enough questions. Isaac spoke plainly. This is not only about Lena or a cruel night at a pier. This is the pattern that held their house together. Pull this thread and everything loosens. I asked him if he had what he needed. He told me he had more than enough and that his next step would not fit into anyone's nice lunch plans. I did not pace the corridor. I walked instead to a small library near the old wing, a space as forgotten as a childhood promise. The smell of dust and paper met me like an embrace that did not require anything in return. Books stacked on a central table rose like small cities of chaos. My hands knew what to do: a cloth to wipe each cover, a glance to read the call number, a movement to fit the spine into the exact place where it belonged. Toni Morrison between Zora Neale Hurston and Alice Walker. A medical guide above a shelf of atlases. A mystery novel in the row where mysteries keep their company. It was not escape. It was balance. Creation set gently beside the destruction I had already put in motion. Near noon, the landline at the nurse's desk rang, and no one answered. I looked at Lena through the glass. Her breath fogged the mask a little. Her fingers twitched and stilled. I wanted to be the kind of mother who could pray without bargaining, but I had no prayers left that were not also plans. When the phone in my pocket trembled again, Isaac said only this: "Your note and the lilies are photographed." The fisherman gave a statement. The retired detective gave a recorded interview. The letters are scanned. The timing of last night can be placed. I am writing now. When I press publish, the piece goes to every newsroom and to every office that can bring weight to bear. He paused and then added something soft, almost tender. Breathe, Eleanor. The truth works like winter. Slow, relentless, impossible to ignore. That afternoon, I returned to Lena and read aloud from a book I found in the library, the kind of story with sentences that sit close to the bone. She slept, but her face smoothed. At 5:40 p.m., my phone vibrated again. Unknown number. I stepped into the hallway and answered. A voice slick with privilege rolled through the speaker. The mayor. He sounded angry and afraid and very tired. Someone had been to see him, a man with questions that cut like wire. He wanted me to understand that he would not cover anything a second time. He said his name must never appear. He said I should make this stop. I thanked him for the warning that he did not intend to give. When I ended the call, the corridor felt larger. Fear is a shrinking room. Honesty opens a window. Dusk gathered early. I stood at the glass and watched the parking lot collect headlights like fallen stars. I could feel the shift without seeing it. Somewhere in an office with dark wood and a view, a man who thought the world obeyed him had learned that the world sometimes answers to older laws. He would be dialing numbers that no longer picked up. He would be hearing words he was not used to hearing. No, not this time. Not anymore. I placed my palm on the glass. It was cool and steady. So was I. Garrett Van Doren sat behind his desk, surrounded by dark oak and quiet arrogance, as if the world itself waited for his permission to spin. His pen rested perfectly parallel to the edge of a stock report he was reading when the phone rang. The number on the screen, Mayor Jim Dalton, should have meant control, not alarm. But the voice on the other end had shed its friendliness. "Garrett, we need to talk." "Not over the phone. Something happened today." He listened as the mayor spoke about a man who called himself a journalist, who asked about Malcolm Pierce about an old drowning and a missing envelope of money. The voice that once bent rules for Garrett now trembled with self-protection. "I'm done covering this up. Solve your problem. Don't let my name appear." and the line went dead. For a long moment, Garrett stared at his reflection in the polished desk. The face that looked back was still handsome in a cold way, but the color had drained from it. He called Preston. His son entered a few minutes later, careless as always, sleeves rolled up arrogance like a cologne. Garrett asked if Eleanor had said anything after the incident. Preston frowned, trying to remember. Nothing important. She just stood there. She's probably still wailing somewhere. Garrett's pulse thudded. No, he said slowly. She was not wailing. She was planning. He rose abruptly and went to the window. The sky outside had turned the same steel color as the lake. The empire he had built on fear and favors was creaking like an old dock in high wind. Across the city, I could feel it the way you sense thunder before it breaks. I did not need to see their panic to know it was real. I had lived too long in their shadow not to recognize the weight of guilt finally finding its mark. I sat by Lena's bed, reading softly, and for the first time since the lake, she smiled faintly in her sleep. My phone vibrated. Isaac again. He spoke quietly, the hunter reporting from the field. They're calling everyone. No one's taking their calls. The mayor cut them off, investors are pulling out, and every contact they use to buy silence is running for cover. They'll try force next, Eleanor. Expect that. His voice carried a note I hadn't heard in years, protective, almost brotherly. I told him to stay hidden. He laughed. You always forget, little sister, I'm very good at disappearing. That night, as hospital lights dimmed to a faint yellow glow, I returned to the tiny library. The shelves I had organized now stood neat and quiet. I wanted to believe that order could be restored everywhere if one only worked patiently enough. I ran a hand along the spines. My hands were steady, almost peaceful. Somewhere out there, I imagined Garrett pacing his son, watching him crumble. I wondered if either of them understood that this wasn't vengeance in the way they imagined. It was correction. The universe filing things where they belonged. But Garrett still had one instinct left: violence. In his desperation, he called the head of his private security team, a man who had long traded conscience for cash. Find Isaac Hayes, he ordered. Make him forget my name. By dawn, 2 black cars rolled into a decaying apartment complex. They climbed 7 flights of stairs and kicked in the door of a place that smelled of dust and emptiness. The room was bare. No one had lived there for months. Garrett's men realized too late they'd been led into a ghost's den. While they stood amid the wreckage of old furniture, Isaac sat miles away in a rented room, his laptop opened, the article complete. He read it once more, each sentence as sharp as a scalpel. Drowned twice in the same lake. The 22-year history of impunity. It contained everything: Pierce's letters, the detective's confession, photographs of the lilies and their mocking note, the fisherman's statement, the timestamps of emergency calls, even a detailed record of the Van Doren family's decades of corruption. Isaac pressed publish, then send. The story flew to every newsroom, every prosecutor's office, every journalist hungry for truth. He sat back, exhaled once, and turned off his phone. The sound of the world breaking open began almost instantly. By morning, the internet roared. Television hosts interrupted their segments. The Van Doren name, once synonymous with influence, now crawled across screens beside words like murder and cover-up. Garrett tried to call his lawyers, but the lines rang out. His business partner froze the accounts. His wife retreated to a sister's home. Preston, for the first time in his pampered life, couldn't find anyone willing to answer. They watched as police cars approached their estate through the wrought iron gates that had once kept everyone else out. Garrett stood very still, the lake glimmering beyond the window, like a mirror showing him what he truly was. I learned of their arrest that afternoon. A young nurse whispered it to another, and the rumor slid down the corridor like wind. I did not react. I simply folded the blanket around Lena's shoulders. Her strength was returning. She asked what would happen next. I told her we were free to decide that ourselves. Freedom, I said, isn't always bright or loud. Sometimes it's just the absence of fear when you wake up. Weeks passed. The world moved on to its next scandal. I spent my days helping Lena pack boxes. The house she had shared with Preston felt empty already. The air smelled of dust and endings. She tore up his letters without reading them. I watched quietly. When everything was ready, I handed her a small ring of keys, the old silver charm still attached. I bought back our apartment near the library, I told her. The walls remember us. She held the keys as if they were light itself. Then she smiled, truly smiled for the first time in years. We drove through the city at sunset, the sky the color of forgiveness. I looked at her beside me alive, calm her eyes, no longer clouded by fear. Revenge had not brought joy, but it had restored order, and in that order, we could finally breathe. I realized that justice isn't a loud triumph. Sometimes it's a mother shelving the last book, closing the door, and knowing the story finally sits where it belongs. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to Clara's Stories. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in Eleanor's place, and whether you believe silence or action heals deeper wounds. Your thoughts keep these stories alive.